Everybody, this is Kelly of Roho Chief Clothing, and this is my Instagram, as you see here. And when you look here, I'm going to click on the link. It will say creator Kelly _ McAlpine. That's to my personal Instagram account. But right here it says follow link to my YouTube, Facebook, and clothing below. So I'm going to click on this link right here. And then when you click on that link, then what's going to happen is that kids sports tee, as you see, baby's clothing. This is a shirt for a toddler. I even have bodysuits for babies. And then going back, I have the category for also women. Tank tops. I also have polo shirts. I also have long sleeve shirts, as well as hoodies for women as well, and also for men. They have the same thing. Men tank tops, men t-shirts, got V-neck shirts, comes in a variety of colors, sizes. So, check me out if you would like to have some fashion that honors your ancestors and shows the world that you know exactly who you are and proud of it. Now, let's get into the video. Hey everybody, this is Kelly of Roho Chief Clothing, and I'm here to talk to you about Dred Scott. And I know when I was in school, elementary school, when I was a child in the Detroit public school system, they try to make it seem as though Dred Scott was a person that was an African that was enslaved in America, but from what it looks like, that Dred Scott was indeed an American Indian. And Copper Hot Step has sent this to me, and I'm about to read some of it. It says, excluding Indians not taxed, Dred Scott, Standing Bear, Elk, and the legal status of Native Americans in the latter half of the 19th century. So it's very interesting that they would say Dred Scott, that they would list him as an Indian, whereas the propaganda in Detroit public schools and probably elsewhere, like Chicago public schools, Philadelphia public schools, Atlanta public schools, they're trying to push the false narrative of him being an African slave. Let's look into it. It says, throughout American history, the federal government has failed to follow a consistent approach in determining the legal and political status of individual Native Americans and Indian tribes. Such policies, treaty making, and reservations, allotment, reorganization, termination, and currently self-determination range from the treatment of Indian tribes as sovereign nations to the assimilation of individual Native Americans as U.S. citizens in the dominant white society. Assimilation generally meant that Native Americans should adopt Euro-American clothing, language, religion, and an agricultural lifestyle before qualifying for citizenship. And see, the thing that really irks me about this is that how could you have a agricultural lifestyle when Indians were already growing different various foods? And by the way, a lot of those foods are shipped from the Americas to other places. So to me, that sounds ridiculous. And then to say that the European culture was the dominant culture, that makes no sense since they are the foreigners on this land, which is America. So anyways, it says even at that, most Native Americans could only expect second-class citizenship status when it came to exercising their constitutional rights and protections simply, but the legal status of individual Native Americans has often been unclear. Since during the latter part of the 19th century, social reformers, the courts, and politicians at the local and state federal level attempted to clarify this issue. It says to understand the difficulty in determining the legal standing of Native Americans, one must first examine the historical meaning and significance of the phrase excluding Indians not taxed. And you see how they're trying to use Indian and Native American, interchangeably, but we know the proper term is, American Indians, because we also know that thanks to Indian Mac, that he had pointed out that in the Constitution they mention American Indian or Indian nations specifically. Beside all that, and plus another thing too that bothers me is the fact that they're saying that Native Americans, better known as American Indians, are second class. How can we be second class citizens and yet we're the ones that's supposed to control the commerce here, and that we have Aboriginal title as well? Okay, so let's just keep that in mind. It says attention should be directed toward Dred Scott versus Sandford, 1857. It says Standing Bear versus Crook, 1879, and Elk versus Wilkins, 1884, arguably the three most significant cases involving the legal status of Native Americans, which we know is supposed to be American Indians, during the latter half of the 19th century. Okay, so right there, I'm going to stop it right there, because you see that they had mentioned Dred Scott versus Sandford, just like they had mentioned Standing Bear versus Crook and Elk versus Wilkins, and they had said that all of these cases dealt with how they dealt with Native Americans and the Native American individuals' legal statuses in the United States. It says collectively they tried to determine, one, how Native Americans could obtain citizenship, the legal rights of individual Native Americans notwithstanding their tribal affiliation, and three, the legal status of individual Native Americans who had paid taxes or had separated themselves from their tribes, despite having the means to readily grant citizenship to Native Americans. The U.S. government largely ignored the wishes of individual Native Americans and often used citizenship as a means of assimilating tribal Indians into a dominant white society. This is after more than a century of treaties and legislative acts affecting the legal status of Native Americans. Congress adopted H.R. 6355, the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which granted citizenship to all non-citizen Indians born within the territorial limits of the United States. By then, almost two-thirds of the Native American population had gained citizenship through treaties or congressional legislation. For example, the 1830 treaty with the Choctaws, which is noteworthy within the context of Indian removal, contained a provision which stated that each Choctaw head of family being desirous to remain and become a citizen of the state shall be permitted to do so. Likewise, the 1887 General Allotment Act declared every Indian born within the territorial limits of the United States to whom allotment shall have been made under the provisions of this act or under any law or treaty, who has voluntarily taken up his residence separate and apart from any tribe of Indians therein, and has adopted the habit of civilized life, it hereby declared to be a citizen of the United States and is entitled to all rights and privileges and immunities of such citizens. The prospect Citizenship, however, did not necessarily guarantee the Native Americans actually gained it, or if they did, that they enjoyed the same rights and privileges as other U.S. citizens. Consequently, whether a citizen or not, the actual legal status of Native Americans remained controversial well into the 20th century. Okay, so I want to skip down, and it says the phrase first appeared in the Articles of Confederation. Article, I believe that's 8, addressed the issue of how to provide for the defense of the United States and the citizenry general welfare. On April 18, 1783, the Confederation Congress sought to amend the original wording of Article 8 in order to specify what groups will contribute to the Treasury to cover those expenses, which shall be supplied by the several states in proportion to the whole number of white and other free citizens and inhabitants, in every age, sex, and condition, including those bound to servitude for a term of years, 3/5 of all of other persons not comprehended in the foregoing description, except Indians not paying taxes in each state. This clause established the principle later included in the Constitution that slaves were only counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of apportionment of taxes and representation in the federal government. By contrast, Native Americans who paid taxes counted as a whole person for apportionment purposes, but they were not necessarily U.S. citizens. Okay, so I will have a link to this article below so that you can read this for yourself and see how they included, Dred Scott's case as a landmark case for how the U.S. government dealt with Native Americans. And I find that to be very interesting. How they have the truth is out here, but that they try to keep it as low key as possible. Tell me, what do you think about this information? Please like, share, and subscribe. I'm out.